Please join me in welcoming Claire Rubin.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Can everybody hear okay? Good. I guess you caught the discrepancy between the 40 and the 38, and I'll explain that in a minute. You heard the title, which is Reflections on 40 Years, but I actually have a subtitle, and it's called 40 Years and 40 Minutes. And if you don't think that was a big assignment, you're incorrect. It used to be, well, it has been in recent months and years, that disasters keep me up at night. After reading, for example, the New Yorker article about the Cascadia seismic range, that's enough to keep you up at 2 a.m. But lately it's been this keynote and preparing a summary of 40 years that's been keeping me up. I don't know why all the great thoughts come at 2 a.m., but that's when things sort of coalesce. So specifically, when Kathleen asked me to do this, she asked me to, quote, provide your reflections on how our community, researchers and practitioners, has evolved over the last 4 decades, and feel free to get personal and to talk about what the community has meant to you. So in terms of being personal, I took that as the liberty to allow for opinions, anecdotes, and a little humor. So that's how I'm going to approach it. I never have prepared a piece quite like this, a personal piece, and even the retrospective part, sort of 20/20 hindsight. I guess that's what I was up at 2 a.m. Things just kept occurring to me when you review your life retrospectively in the products that you've produced and what you've been doing. So it is a personal history. I'm going to run through quite a few things, and I'll give you a bit of background. She did give you some. I've been kind of in all facets of this. I've been a researcher, a consultant, a practitioner, and I've been in an academic setting. I've been I have my own firm, and I work independently. So I've come at it, and I've had quite a range of experience with government agencies, a few universities, consulting firms, my own firm, and the like. This is what surprised me when I did the retrospective about how many places I'd worked, and I've thought of at least 3 more, and a couple whose names I can't recall. So this is a bit of a checkered history. But I like to think I'm versatile. But on the other hand, you could say, that's a lady who can't hold a job. But and one thing in reviewing all this has occurred to me. I've had a lot of jobs, partly, and I've always wondered if it's me, it's the circumstances, the environment, but there's kind of a fundamental issue, and that is I do not have a PhD, and therefore I would never, although I've been an adjunct faculty, I would never be a tenured member of anybody's faculty, and not likely that I would be asked to head up a research center. So part of me wonders whether having to do many jobs and work in many things, although it's fun and exciting and varied, but it's a very hard way to make a living, and it's actually not something I recommend. So let me speak for a moment about the center and the people at the center and the importance of this center. And again, the talk is not about the center. Kathleen made that clear. No, just a second, sorry. I think I jumped a slide. Nope. Okay. I'll say a few words about the center. The center obviously began in 1975, and the workshop has been important to me and everybody who's attended. The knowledge that's been imparted, excuse me, is very valuable. The contacts that you make here, we had some great serendipitous interrelationships just this morning having breakfast. Friendships form, projects created, and quite a bit gets accomplished in a few days. So as you probably figured out, I actually haven't attended all 40 workshops. I know the very first one was in Estes Park, and for sure I wasn't there. but I have been to either 38 or 39 consecutive workshops, and apparently I do hold the record. But I guess Denny Wenger, I think, is just one whisker behind me from our conversation. And I was curious about the 1975 workshop, and I happen to know two people who were there. Now, both these men are in their 90s, and I called them up and I asked them, and they had the most amazingly fresh recollections. One was Roy Popkin, who used to work at Red Cross headquarters in disaster services, and the other is Hugo Morelli, who worked for FEMA and then even the predecessor to FEMA, Federal Disaster Assistance Administration. And both remember that workshop quite clearly, and I asked them for recollections. And among other things, Gilbert White, the famed geographer, was the head of the center, and Gilbert ran that. Now, if any of you know Gilbert, I kind of ran it tight and fast and made them all work hard, and they do remember that. They said it's hardly any spare time. It was interesting as to why they went and the impression. Roy, as a practitioner with the Red Cross, said his boss sent him to the conference because he wanted Roy to tell the researchers, be less critical of responders in your reports, because responders are very tired and very stressed at the time of the interviews. So I thought that was cute. He was there to give him feedback. Hugo was in a different situation. He said he was new to the field, having come from private industry, and he wanted to go. Gilbert, I don't know how he knew Gilbert, but Gilbert invited him, and Hugo said it was his first exposure to hazards, natural hazards, and mitigation, and it was really instrumental in his career. He spent 25 years on seismic safety matters. So those are recollections from the first one where I was not there. So I would like to speak briefly about the center in its annual workshop as a kind of focal point for us. And there were some very key people in the early days. I call this a pantheon of experts. The early people in the field, men people for the most part early on, Gilbert White, whom you've heard mentioned, a geographer, Henry Corantelli and Russ Dines with the Disaster Research Centers, both sociologists, and Charlie Fritz. Unfortunately, his picture we couldn't find. Charlie was an excellent sociologist, researcher, and he was at the National Academy of Sciences. And those people were kind of key players when I first came to the field in the late 70s. And then there were others who were at a different level. They weren't researchers, but they performed other important things. Key people for me, Hugo Morelli and Roy, whom I mentioned, and Bill Anderson at the National Science Foundation. Bill had many jobs, but when Bill was at NSF, he funded a number of projects and helped support, among other things, some of the early work we did on research. Now, the good news is in later years, we now have prominent women researchers. And just a few who are here, Kathleen, Shirley Laska, Susan Cutter, many others, but we now have more. We have always had an issue with African Americans and other minorities, from early on to even now, it's underrepresented. So the net result is the value of the workshops is just immeasurable, and the people I meet here formed not only lasting professional relationships, but lifelong friends. So it's really been wonderful. Just a bit about how I get into this, because I'm a social scientist with a public administration background and had worked for HUD and the International City Management Association or whatever. I did not grow up wanting to be a disaster, but I did get into this about 1977, as soon as I could, clearly as I can figure it out. And that's shortly before FEMA was formed. FEMA was formed in 1979, and I was in on some of the discussions and background and when FEMA was being formed. Now, the fun part is I've been in this business longer than FEMA has. So, my initial contact, I was director of contract research at the International City Managers Association, and two men came by the office one day. One was Hugo, and the other was Chuck Thiel from the National Science Foundation. They both were working with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, in the Executive Office of the President, and they were working on getting the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Act implemented. And they had all the technical stuff down pat, but part of their work was to get community participation and an understanding. At that time, people thought earthquakes only happened in California and Alaska, and the rest of the country was safe. Not so, they just didn't know otherwise. And so they came by and they said, would you help us organize some public meetings, get some mayors and city managers and officials in these communities and other public interest groups. And NGA was doing a lot of work for the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, which is a predecessor to FEMA. Anyway, for those of you old enough, the NGA turned out 3 really excellent reports. They had a major project with funding, with field research and whatever, and they oddly enough, they issued a volume on terrorism, and most important, and I could not find the right cover, but they issued a volume on comprehensive emergency management. So it was 1978, the National Governors Association, all preceding FEMA, and later they did all this groundbreaking research, produced these excellent reports that were cited for years, and it provided a lot of baseline, both personnel and reports and concepts, the CEM concept that went to FEMA. Later on, I started to do timeline charts. In the 90s, when I was affiliated with George Washington University as an adjunct faculty member, at that time there weren't very many books and resources and other things, and gradually we were just pasting things together. Still true now, still true of this group. You have an array of people who are new to the field, veterans to the field, specialized in this, that, and the other. But primarily, not everybody was from the U.S. in my classes, and we needed a basic point of reference. So that led to developing initially the disaster timeline, which is natural hazards and disasters, and I have some copies here. And anybody who wants to look at timelines, they're all available at disaster-timeline.com, and a bunch of them are online. You can browse them. So I began to develop timelines, and people found them kind of a useful shorthand for understanding what happened and what led to what. Later, we did a terrorism timeline, a century timeline that went with the book, and we even did a Canadian timeline along with our colleagues. So a key feature of the timeline when we were constructing them is essentially how reactive our national system of emergency management is. You have events and outcomes, and it became quite clear that major events drove changes and improvements in the national emergency systems. And with very minor exceptions, we never got ahead of the curve. It was always changes and reactions and changes in programs, regs, laws. You know, we just heard about it with Sandy. There's always new legislation, post-Katrina Act. It happens all the time. We just don't get ahead. But it was kind of interesting to lay it out, and you kind of get it quickly. Looking back on my career, I see 2 essential elements. One is the hazards and disaster community, mostly here. I also go to other meetings, but I consider this a primary source of contacts, inspiration, and whatever. The second factor is being based in Washington, D.C., and kind of watching the feds, a Fed watcher. Particularly watching FEMA. I'm a resident-based FEMA watcher. So with regard to the community, definitely number 1 in importance is this group and the contacts I've made here and the nearly 40 years I've spent here. And the second group that I spend time with is FEMA's Emergency Management Institute and their annual conference symposium. For those who are teaching, like to teach, higher education in emergency management. They're in their 17th year, and I haven't been to all of those, but many. And so there's an overlap. I'm sure many people here have been there, and vice versa, but not quite. My perception kind of roughly characterizes that people who are here include many of the major researchers and practitioners who create the intellectual content for education and training, the books, the training materials, the charts, the material. So I see this group as kind of creating, some deliver it as well, but more on the creation and innovation. The second group, the group that attends at EMI, primarily delivers education and training, although, again, they too do some research. But I find those 2 communities interesting. And the other thing is a personal observation. I don't know how many people share it, but I tend to think of the Hazard Center as a professional association. It offers an annual workshop. It has a library, has a newsletter or 2, it supports a community of people with common interests, but doesn't collect dues, and it doesn't have any committees. So get all the good stuff without the negative requirements. I guess I mentioned the organizations and the contacts with various groups. But I'd just like to spend a minute and mention just two things that have happened here of the many, many hallway conversations and connections and linkages. One interesting connection between research and practitioners. Some years back, we had some NSF funding, and some colleagues and I had done some work. And a sidebar of what we had done was we had redone FEMA's data on disaster declarations, and FEMA does it sequentially. You know, there's this flood, and they had characterized it by, I don't know, we've had 12 hurricanes, but they never made a list. I don't know if they do now. I hope they do. They never had made a list of what communities were getting the most declarations. So we had some economists and some students, and we redid their data. And in a 20-year period, and I don't remember the exact span, the city of Tulsa had more disaster declarations than any place in the country. And I was reporting out on that to a group, and in the audience was Ann Patton, who was working for the mayor in the city of Tulsa. Now, she knew it had floods. She had been flooded out of her home a couple times, and she said, wow, we hold the record for the most declarations. This is embarrassing. So she went home with a copy of the report and the data and talked to the mayor. And it apparently was the tipping point, and they began a flood mitigation program in earnest when they finally realized how bad they were. So that I'm kind of proud of that. The other thing that happened here that was fun for me, we were out in the garden of a previous hotel, and I was talking to Jerry Hootmer, who was then the executive director of a group called Public Entity Risk Institute, private group that had foundational money, and he could fund whatever he wanted. And Jerry had seen the timelines and said, we really need a book on the history of emergency management. We don't have that. I said, yeah, that's a good idea. Jerry and I, both from Washington, make this connection here at the meeting. And so I agreed to be editor of the book, and he agreed to support it. So that was certainly very nice, and the timelines led into that. The book is now in its second edition, and oddly enough, the book has outlived Perry. Perry failed a couple of years ago. Financial crisis got them, and the book still goes on, which is kind of nice. And here's Washington. So the Washington, D.C. experience, being there, worked in EPA, worked with FEMA and a variety of things, it had a lot of exposure. And as I say, from the beginning of FEMA on, just was very, very interesting to see the evolution and the process, and having the chance to work with federal practitioners and a lot of their contractors. So the two things, the kind of intellectual exposure and contacts, and oddly enough, they occurred in Colorado, and kind of the action and the money was in Washington, and those two factors were kind of defining factors for me. So I want to talk briefly about some specific events that have happened, disaster events and outcomes that have happened in the last 40 years. And I'm not going to go through it decade by decade, but divided it up. We basically have the last 25 years of the 20th century and the first 15 years of the 21st century. So here we go. The 20th century. In the last century, we saw the buildup of emergency management field, great growth in terms of numbers, agencies, organizations, just development of all kinds of things, plans, policy, tools, higher education programs in emergency management, and the increasing professionalism of the field. I feel we've stalled a little bit in the 21st century, and we're struggling a bit because we don't have so much development to do. I don't want to suggest that nothing positive has happened, and actually yesterday's speakers had a lot of positive achievement, whether it's in economics and urban planning, information technology, but I guess the things that don't work or need work kind of catch my attention, and what's working doesn't get so much attention. So let's talk about some of the things that did happen in the last 25 years of the last century. We had, the various hurricanes and the floods, and a great deal went on. There was a lot to deal with, and it was quite noticeable, and things seem to be growing in size and in complexity. And in terms of what was going on in development, sort of the intellectual developments and outcome during that period. I mentioned the work of the National Governors Association that went on and how important it was when FEMA was formed in '79 and how it contributed. Gradually, the response efforts by FEMA got attention, and there were various developments in what ultimately was a federal response plan and then a federal response framework. During that time, an early textbook, the ICMA Green Book on Emergency Management, which is issued in 1991 and was used by many people for a decade and a half. FEMA funded that ICMA textbook, and I think that it was an important contribution to developing higher education in emergency management. And I mentioned the Public Entity Risk Institute, which had an endowment, was formed in 1997, and they did some interesting things. Jerry Hootmer was a risk taker. They funded a lot of small projects. They exerted a lot of independence. They funded holistic recovery here at the center, and I miss Perry. Perry did a lot of very interesting things. I worked on some products. During that period of time, the cover is a little skewed, but in the early 1980s, thanks to the money from the National Science Foundation, we had a team going out looking at how communities recover from disasters, and we tried very hard to understand the key variables. We're still working very hard to figure out the key variables. I did field work on Hurricane Hugo. We did field work on Hurricane Andrew. And just after Hurricane Andrew, which occurred in 1992, for those of you who remember, the response to Hurricane Andrew went very, very badly. And Congress was very angry at FEMA. And Congress allocated some money for the National Academy of Public Administration to take a hard look at what FEMA was doing. And the attitude was, fix it or end it. So I happened to be part of the team that worked on that NAPA report, Coping with Catastrophe. I think we have a slide. And looking back, I view this as a really very important, very significant product that in fact did influence decision makers and public policy and had a kind of lasting effect. I can't say that about a lot of things in my bookcase, but I am glad to be able to say it for a few things. And I'll just give you a quick capsule of why I think that report was important. It was essentially the first in-depth evaluation of FEMA. FEMA was 12 years old at that time and stumbled rather badly with Hurricane Andrew. The governor held back on asking for a declaration. FEMA held back. Just a whole bunch of things happened, and it did not go well. So we, in the Coping with Catastrophe analysis, we took a hard look at everything and anything. It was influential because when we finished the report in the spring of 1993, James Lee Witt was just coming into FEMA, and the team leader was smart enough to brief James Lee on what was in the report, what the recommendations were, what the flaws were, and James Lee had the basis of that evaluation and their recommendations, and I believe he acted on it. I have no inside knowledge, but I think the report was instrumental in his significant efforts to do hazard mitigation, to change the culture internally, to get more proactive. A number of things happened, and I credit that. So that's one report that, at least, there are others, but just an example of how research can be influential, and once in a while you get to the policymakers. As they said yesterday, not often enough. So let's jump to the 21st century, and what's interesting, I mean, we're only 15 years into it, and already we're seeing a record in the three categories of disasters: man-made, intentional, man-made, accidental, and natural. We have seen at least a record-setting event in each category already, and we're not very far into this century. Elsewhere in the world, Haiti, Japan, Nepal, we are seeing, as the last speaker indicated, we are just seeing some incredible larger, more complex and compounding effects, and they really are focusing events and game changers, and entire books have been written about all of it. But I just want to briefly touch on two things that resulted in terms of major organizational or professional outcomes from these events. and I'll use the terrorism timeline just as a way of getting a snapshot of what 9/11 meant. And this is primarily from the standpoint of public policy and laws, regs, organizational changes. In the terrorism timeline, in the basically really one major driver event, the 9/11, three events in 9/11, as a result, in less than a decade, just in the years 2001 to 2008, there were 21 major national laws enacted, 36 executive directives, 38 national strategies, plans, or national level exercises, and 14 other federal actions that included organizational changes, including the big one, the formation of DHS. So that is an extraordinary outpouring of public policy. With regard to Hurricane Sandy, I was talking to some people earlier, we still don't even know the end of the Sandy story. Sandy had a rather dramatic effect, a dramatic response, and the response for the most part went well. Have to compliment FEMA and the Red Cross. They really did a good job and worked very hard. What stands out to me with regard to Sandy is that the recovery phase is the crucial story, and that's why it's still unfolding, and that's why I'm wondering how we'll summarize it when we put it in a future issue of the book. But the Sandy response went well. There was a lot of anticipatory planning. There was a lot of learning from Hurricane Katrina, and the recovery phase in New York, New Jersey, where they generate a very large portion of our GDP. It's just been an extraordinary thing. The number of housing units, the amount of infrastructure, it is really major. Some unusual organizational changes and arrangements were made, the outcome of which we still don't know. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was given a major lead. A special task force was created, and many things are underway. So it was instrumental, and we're still waiting for the outcome. Perhaps HUD will be a bigger player in future disasters, and some as a result of the kinds of things, the events that I just described, the projects and products I was involved in, including when I was at GW in 2003, my boss, Jack Harold at George Washington University's Institute, and I co-founded a journal, an online journal, which was a little exotic at the time, Journal of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And the intent was to try and understand what the emergency management community was in relation to Homeland Security. We're still trying to figure it out. But anyway, we gave that a shot with a new journal. Were additional timeline charts, and the first edition of the book on the history of emergency management came out in 2007. So, oh dear, I need to rush a little bit. I want to talk about what worked and what didn't work in the last 40 years, and this is not a great place to rush, but this is what makes life so hard in this community, which is you got California, think an earthquake, and what do we got? A drought. And if you could read the small print, it says we always thought the big one would be an earthquake, and that's kind of the situation. In the 21st century, we've got these ever-changing hazards. Now, down at the bottom, there's Noah swimming. He said, "Sure, I was warned, but the remedy sounded difficult." And then the very small print at the bottom said, "He has gathered excuses 2 by 2." Not animals, but excuses. So, briefly, I want to touch on a matter of our increasing knowledge. There's more of us, we're smarter, we have more products. Does it reduce the hazard loss and risk and whatever? Not necessarily. Susan Cutter did an excellent job in the presentation she gave at the National Academy of Sciences. It was the memorial lecture in honor of Gilbert White, and she deals with this, and I would recommend that you read that and see her material. How many minutes do I have? I'm sorry? Okay. Kind of a final thought here. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me jump back a little bit. There are a few other things that I would like to cover. Just a couple of general observations, jumping back to the events in the 20th century. The research community, a few observations. It was smaller. It was more personal. if you were looking for, and thanks to this meeting, if you wanted to know who was doing international work or who was active in doing economic analysis, you could call them up. There were fewer research centers. We got to know each other, and there were lots of phone calls, and personal exchanges, and the community was small enough to kind of network. And of course, that was before the internet, so we did things differently in those days. Federal agency involvement, FEMA got the most attention. FEMA used to be a major player. They used to fund this center. They used to do outreach to the public interest groups. For example, ICMA and the National Governors Association and others used to work with FEMA and have programs related to FEMA's programs on their annual conferences, and many things went on. FEMA, in its roughly 40 years of history, has had a lot of peaks and troughs. Probably the bottom was the Giuffrida era, where some people even went to jail for malfeasance, 1981 to 1985. Looking back, most people now think the James Lee Witt administration and the Clinton administration, 1993 to 2001, was the high point for much of the national level frameworks that had been addition. So FEMA was a key player. The federal government was very important, got a lot of respect. They drove a lot of guidance, information, inspiration to the U.S. and other countries. What didn't work so well is we tried for years to capture lessons learned, and that hasn't really been entirely successful. And another plus is the education and training. I think there's something like 250 colleges, universities, community colleges that now teach courses in Homeland Security and emergency management. A lot of that growth came in the last century. In the current century, emergency management field is changing for reasons I've seen, new threats, new problems, new hazards, complex and compound events, and everything's more costly and bigger. And as the last speaker suggested, even governments are running out of money. Big problems recently with federal and congressional actions. There's just on the micro level, there's no shortage from FEMA of rules, regs, guidance, documents, requirements, and we list them all in the timelines, and I don't even know how local officials and state officials deal with them. Probably they don't. But at the same time that the rules and regs and the requirements are piling up, the supply of things you have to do is higher, there's less money for state and local personnel, and fewer people given to it, and something doesn't happen in your community for a couple of years, they abolish the local emergency management agency. That's happened in a few places, and that doesn't bode well. Other current problems are the FEMA workforce. FEMA has several kinds of personnel that work for them. They have full-time employees, they have reservists, like the military does, and they have something called FEMA Corps, which are AmeriCorps people who work at FEMA. Morale is very low at DHS. It has been for several years. Pretty hard job keeping up the spirits of the regular staff, lots of demands. The FEMA reservist system was changed, and it seems to be in chaos. Reservists whom I talk to are extremely unhappy, and the use of the FEMA Corps with youthful, slightly trained young adults who are inexpensive, they try hard and they mean well, but that isn't quite what we need for recovery and mitigation and very in-depth kind of matters. You don't have to take my word on this. The GAO just did a very extensive report of FEMA's workforce just about a week or two ago, and they have been on them for some time. But with regard to the research community, I see the gap between the academics, the researchers, the practitioners, actually has widened in some ways. It's because there are more academic research centers, there are more conferences, there are now Homeland Security people and emergency management people, all kinds of specialists, more federal agencies, more personnel, more consultants, and just simply the number of intermediaries between the research community and the practitioner community in the form of consultants and various other groups that have gotten in between them, I think has in some ways widened the gap, and that's too bad. I personally have a lot of problems with the way FEMA funds research and DHS funds research, and these so-called centers of excellence, which are amalgamations of organizations that don't normally work together, and they put them together and call them centers of excellence. I kind of view them as research oligarchies, and that means that individual institutions and certainly individual researchers, excuse me, who have a good idea don't stand a snowball's chance, you know where, to get support. And without Perry and other kinds of groups, and of course they can go to the National Science Foundation, but as an individual, you're not likely to surmount that process. So it's just very difficult for people like me and other people with small projects and independent and don't have an institutional base to get stuff done like we used to. And researchers can't readily access key officials. Yesterday there was a mention of the article in Science magazine. I had noted that and talked to both Kathleen and to the head of DRC. The author, I found the whole article surprising. One, she didn't seem to realize that the DRC, she said there should be some disaster science centers. You know, have 40 years for this place and 50 years for DRC, and she didn't know that. She made a good point, which is there needs to be a better connect between the disaster science centers and personnel and public officials in getting things implemented. But the thing that is totally ironic is the woman who wrote the editorial is the editor of Science magazine. She is formerly the head of the U.S. Geological Survey. So I don't know where the woman has been who doesn't know this center in DRC doesn't exist. Anyway, there's a reduced reliance on FEMA, and frankly, as a reliable partner in emergency management, and frankly, one can't take the federal government as seriously or view them as important as you used to. Someone from Brookings Institution wrote a major op-ed piece, and it was titled, "How Washington Made Itself Irrelevant." And the essence of it was the way Congress is acting and the way budgets are being handled and sequestrations and shutdowns and threats of shutdown, not to mention, you know, they're always paring that's sequestration, paring everyone's budget back. How can anybody rely on them? You saw the fight over money for Hurricane Sandy. Senators, the New York Republican delegation was furious with people in Oklahoma and elsewhere. They had voted money for them after their tornado, and they had a devil of a time getting money for Hurricane Sandy. And so these kinds of things are really quite awful. So for me personally, concerns are lagging mitigation and recovery. Oh, I'm already up to my closing thought. I apologize. And again, I want to reiterate that there has been positive change, but there remain many things to do. I do feel that I have been concerned about recovery because I had, from 1985 on, done work in research, disappointed that there hasn't been more research, and I'd like to think both the FEMA and the research community can do more about recovery. But I have to say, since I've been at this meeting, I'm more encouraged because I met about a half a dozen people, including some from Christchurch, who are in fact doing work on recovery. So I'm feeling a little more cheerful about that. Two final thoughts, if you let me. I'd like to see more non-federal sources of funds, and I compliment the Bill Anderson Foundation for tackling things that need to be done. And I lament the fact that we no longer have a Perry. And I leave it with a closing thought, which is I know we're facing lots of challenges, and I surely hope we're up to the challenge. Thank you.